If you have made it this far, we are in chapter 2 of EJI's Reconstruction in America report, which is entitled Freedom to Fear. Right, again, my goal here is to outline American descendants of slavery history and where we came from Reconstruction unto now, and reading all the reports that outline our experience from Reconstruction unto now. So if you don't know what our goal is, this is our goal here at ADOS Reports, is to outline that history, and the EJI is doing a great job of outlining what Reconstruction looked like for the formerly enslaved person, for the American descendants of slavery. All right, and chapter 2 reads, Freedom to Fear, a terrifying and deadly backlash. So determined were most white Southerners to maintain their own way of life that they resorted to fraud, intimidation, and murder in order to reestablish their own control of the state governments. The new civil war within the Southern states stemmed from an adamant determination to restore white supremacy. Historian Henry Louis Gates. In this chapter, we'll talk about black political mobilization and white backlash, fighting for education, and resisting economic exploitation. During Reconstruction, the period of legal, political, and social recreation that followed the Civil War, federal officials and troops remained in the South to enforce black people's new rights of freedom and citizenship, and to administer educational and other programs for the formerly enslaved. For the first time, black people in the region comprised a community of voters, public officials, landowners, wage earners, and free American citizens. Continued support for racial hierarchy meant that American slavery and the ideas underlying it could not be changed solely through elections and laws. As white people attacked black people for asserting their rights, the Reconstruction era's initial hope and progress gave way to devastating, deadly violence. Most white people refused to accept emancipation and black citizenship. They instead responded to Reconstruction's progress by using force and terror to disenfranchise, marginalize, and traumatize black communities while killing countless black people. And this is a picture of 1866 New Orleans massacres from the Harper's Weekly. Shortly after passage of the 13th Amendment, white mobs began to target black people simply for claiming their freedom. On July 30th, 1866, at what is today the Roosevelt Hotel, New Orleans, was hosting a convention of white men working to make sure Louisiana's new constitution would guarantee black voting rights. In the weeks leading up to the convention, local press denounced the attendees as traitors and invaders. Quote, within a short time, end quote, warned the Louisiana Democrat, quote, we may expect to see the state of Louisiana a member of the Union with nigger suffrage, nigger senators, and nigger representatives, end quote. When local black men staged a march to support the convention, the seething opposition erupted in violence as white police and mob members indiscriminately killed black people in the area. Quote, for several hours, the police and mob, in mutual and bloody emulation, continued the butchery in the hall and on the street until nearly 200 people were killed and wounded, end quote. A congressional committee formed to investigate the massacre concluded in 1877, quote, how many were killed will never be known, but we cannot doubt there were many more than set down in the official list of evidence, end quote. As Reconstruction continued, the terror attacks that white mobs committed grew more structured and group-based. Quote, a lawlessness which in 1865 through 1868 was still spasmodic and episodic, now became organized, end quote. W.E.B. Du Bois later observed, quote, using a technique of mass and midnight murder, the South began widely organized aggression upon the Negroes, end quote. Organized and violent white resistance to Reconstruction was born in Pulaski, Tennessee on December 25th, 1865, when 6 Confederate veterans formed the first chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, KKK. Functioning from its inception as a political paramilitary arm of white supremacist interests, the Klan engaged in a campaign of terror, violence, and murder targeting African Americans and white people who supported black civil rights. The Klan and similar organizations, including the Knights of the White Camellia and the Palefaces, were largely independent and decentralized, but shared aims and tactics to form a vast network of terrorist cells. By the 1868 president election, those cells were poised to act as a unified military force, supporting the cause of white supremacy throughout the South. And this is a memorial at the EJI Legacy Pavilion in Montgomery, Alabama. Is inscribed with the names of 500 black people lynched during Reconstruction. In Georgia on October 29, 1869, Klansmen attacked and brutally whipped 52-year-old Abram Colby, a formerly enslaved black man who had been elected to Congress by enfranchised freedmen. Shortly before the attack, a group of Klansmen comprised of white doctors and lawyers tried to bribe Mr. Colby to change parties or resign from office. When he refused, the men brutally attacked him. Mr. Colby later testified before a congressional committee, quote, "The mob took me to the woods and whipped me 3 hours or more and left me for dead," end quote. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, when a black man named Andrew Flowers defeated a white candidate in the 1870 race for justice of the peace, Klansmen whipped him and told him that, quote, "they did not intend any nigger to hold office in the United States," end quote. On the night of March 6, 1871, a mob of armed white men hanged a black man named James Williams in York County, South Carolina, and terrorized the local African American community, assaulting residents and burning homes. Mr. Williams, enslaved before the Civil War, had recently organized a coalition to protect the freedom of black people in York County. White residents circulated rumors claiming that he posed a threat, and as his former enslaver later testified, his presence, quote, "caused a great deal of uneasiness," end quote. Details of the lynching were sparsely documented, but federal officials arrested and prosecuted several alleged members of the mob. One testified during trial that after hanging Mr. Williams, the mob stopped to get, quote, "some crackers and whiskey," end quote. Despite the admission, all charges were later dismissed or discontinued, and no one was ever held accountable for Mr. Williams' death. This is the memorial at EJI Legacy Pavilion. Features the locations and estimated death tolls of 34 Reconstruction era massacres that targeted black communities. York County, South Carolina. In 1871, federal investigators found evidence of 11 murders and more than 600 whippings and other assaults in York County, South Carolina, where nearly the entire white male population had joined the Klan. When local grand juries failed to take action, federal authorities urged President Ulysses S. Grant to intervene, describing the state as, quote, "under the domination of systematic and organized depravity," end quote, that created a, quote, "carnival of crime not paralleled in history of any civilized community," end quote. More than 60 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois described Klan violence as, quote, "armed guerrilla warfare," end quote, and estimated that between 1866 and mid-1867, the Klan committed 197 murders and 548 aggravated assaults in North and South Carolina alone. Indiana to Missouri. A similar white terrorist campaign started in Indiana and spread throughout the country, calling themselves whitecaps. Mobs of poor white farmers targeted black people. They were viewed as economic competition and threatened them with death if they refused to abandon their land and to give up their jobs. In most cases, local law enforcement's indifference or inability to protect black residents allowed the whitecaps to commit violence and murder without fear of legal repercussions. In Missouri, one newspaper reported that the whitecaps had, quote, become almost as formidable and the mysterious as the most famous Ku Klux, end quote. Warren, Kentucky. In Warren, Kentucky on September 5th, 1868, a white mob affiliated with the Ku Klux Klan surrounded the house of William Glasgow, a black man and former Union soldier who had been privileged to vote in favor of black rights in the upcoming election. The mob demanded that he come outside. When Mr. Glasgow refused, the mob broke into his house and killed him in front of his wife, then went to another cabin and hanged an inoffensive Negro, quote, inoffensive, quote, Negro, end quote, who had also served in the Union Army. St. Helena Parish, Louisiana. Less than 2 months later, in October 29, 1868, a white mob in St. Helena Parish, Louisiana, seized and shot to death John Kemp, a literate black coroner and an active political organizer. Columbia, Florida. Later that fall, Prince Weaver, a prominent African American in Columbia, Florida, hosted a social gathering at his home. 5 or 6 disguised men fired on the gathering, killing 13-year-old Samson Weaver and severely wounding 3 others. Prince Weaver reportedly had been, quote, been warned against, end quote, holding political meetings at his house. After the attack, he learned that the shots were intended to kill him and fled his community in search of safety. These acts were not committed only by marginalized extremists. Countless white people participated in attacking and killing black people to defend white supremacy. As historian Eric Foner explains, the quote, wave of counter revolutionary terror that swept over large parts of the South between 1868 and 1871 lacks a counterpart either in the American experience or in that of the other Western Hemisphere societies that abolished slavery in the 19th century, end quote. The growing wave of terror and racial violence persisted throughout Reconstruction as white communities grew increasingly bold and confident in their ability to kill black people with impunity. And the violence expanded beyond organized groups like the Klan. In the first years of after emancipation, black people who bravely seized new opportunities to exercise political power, pursue education, and resist economic exploitation risked their own lives to chart a new path. Racial violence killed many and terrorized many more with the knowledge that their long sought and hard won freedom now placed them in danger. Black political mobilization and white backlash. The black community mobilized after passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, organizing meetings, parades, and petitions calling for the implementation of their legal and political rights, including the right to vote. During the first 2 years of Reconstruction, black people formed equal rights leagues throughout the South. These groups held state and local conventions protesting discriminatory treatment and demanding the right to vote and equality before the law. And these is 2 pictures. A picture of Hiram Revels, the nation's first black senator, and Robert Smalls, Civil War hero and Reconstruction congressman. As a result of this activism, in 10 of the 11 former Confederate states, approximately 80% of eligible black male voters were registered by the summer of 1867. As new local, state, and federal governments formed, scores of newly anticipated black men exercised their right to vote, and organized campaigns to run for elected office. When Senator Hiram Revels of Mississippi, the first African American elected to serve in Congress, took office on February 25th, 1870, Senator Charles Sumner, a white Massachusetts politician who had helped lead the legislative civil rights efforts that followed the Confederate defeat, exclaimed, quote, "All men are created equal," says the Great Declaration. And now a great act attests this verity. Today we make the Declaration a reality, end quote. Senator Revels was a Mississippi-born preacher and veteran of the United States colored troops who personified African American emancipation and enfranchisement. In 1869, black voters elected him to a seat in Mississippi State Senate. The next year, he was elected to fill the United States Senate seat previously occupied by a white enslaver. Senator Revels toured the country after taking office and was introduced to the audiences as the 15th Amendment in flesh and blood. And in 1871 speech advocating for the end of school segregation, he declared, quote, I am true to my own race. I wish to see all done that can be done for their encouragement, to insist to assist them in acquiring property, in becoming intelligent, enlightened, useful, valuable citizens. I wish to see this much done for them, and I believe God makes it the duty of this nation to do this much for them. End quote. Although he served only a year in office, Senator Revels broke new ground for African Americans in Congress, and others followed. In 1874, Robert Smalls was elected to Congress from Beaufort County, South Carolina. 12 years earlier, while working as an enslaved crewman aboard the Planter, a Confederate ammunition transport ship, Mr. Smalls piloted the ship out of Charleston Harbor and delivered it to the Union Navy. Recognized for his bravery and skill, he became one of the first African American pilots in the United States Navy. In the House of Representatives, Representative Smalls fought tirelessly against racial segregation in the military, railroads, and restaurants. And here is a picture of the first colored senators and representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. During Reconstruction, an estimated 2,000 black men served in elected office from local and state positions all the way up to Congress. Almost half of the elected black office holders served in South Carolina and Louisiana, where black people had the longest history of political organization. In most other states, African Americans were underrepresented compared to their population. Some black leaders had gained their freedom before the Civil War, while others had worked hard as skilled artisans during enslavement or served in the Union Army. A large number of black political leaders came from the church, having worked as ministers during enslavement and in the early years of Reconstruction. In all, 16 African Americans served in Congress during Reconstruction. More than 600 were elected to state legislatures, and hundreds more held local offices across the South. The newly elected and racially integrated Reconstruction governments took bold action at the state level, repealing discriminatory laws, rewriting apprenticeship and vagrancy statutes that had widely led to black people's re-enslavement and arrest after emancipation, outlawing corporal punishment and sharply reducing the number of capital offenses. African Americans also served on juries and won elections to law enforcement positions like sheriff and chief of police. At the same time that African Americans were participating in government in unprecedented numbers, many white elected leaders worked to undermine and substantially diminish black political power. In his 1867 annual message to Congress, President Johnson declared that black Americans had, quote, less capacity for government than any other race of people, end quote, that they would, quote, relapse into barbarism, end quote. If left to their own devices, and that giving them voting rights would result in any quote a tyranny such as the continent has never witnessed, end quote. The rhetoric from the nation's highest office encouraged white people, especially in the South, who stood determined to destroy a politically empowered black voting bloc. In 1870, a black legislator named Richard Burke was attempting to organize a meeting of African Americans in Sumter County, Alabama, when he was shot and killed near his home. Mr. Burke was accused of encouraging armed black people to stage a protest in Livingston, Alabama, but the Southern Republican newspaper reported that the charges against Mr. Burke were most likely made up as an excuse to kill him for his political leadership. Across the United States, white mobs waged bloody massacres to prevent black communities from exercising their voting rights. In 1868, Colonel Pierce and Captain Murphy, two politicians supporting black civil rights, attempted to enter the town of Camilla, Georgia, to speak at a public event. An armed mob of white men met them outside town and warned them that white residents were prepared to respond with violence if they honored their speaking engagement. When the men refused to be intimidated by the mob, the sheriff informed them that, quote, the people would not allow radicals to speak at Camilla, end quote. Instead of offering the men protection, the sheriff threatened them against exercising their constitutional right to assembly. At the courthouse, a white mob violently attacked Colonel Pierce, Captain Murphy, and several black people attending the event. And the end newspaper reported that 7 African Americans, including a woman and a baby, had been killed and at least 30 other people were wounded. Less than 2 months later, on Election Day in Savannah, Georgia, a group of black men standing in line at the polling station were accused of blocking the door, and an altercation between black and white voters ensued. Responding police officers fired into the crowd, injuring at least 20 people and killing 3 black people, Sam Parsons, Peter Hopkins, and a third unidentified victim. Massacres in New Orleans in 1868 and the Eufaula, Alabama, and Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1874 are among many more examples. The election yesterday. A terrible riot. 3 Negroes killed, 1 policeman mortally wounded, large number slightly wounded. Headline reporting election violence in Savannah, Georgia. Atlanta Constitution, November 7th, 1868. Fighting for education. During enslavement, white people restricted or denied black people's access to education. The myth of racial difference was rooted in the, quote, fact, end quote, of black inferiority and intellectual incapacity and their resulting dependence on benevolent white masters. Yet, white hostility to black literacy in education was actually evidence that enslaved people wanted to learn, and that the development of black knowledge, particularly knowledge of their own claims to rights and freedom, was a threat to the white racial dominance. Quote, in most of us colored folks was the great desire to be able to read and write, end quote. John W. Fields, 89, recalled in 1936. Decades after he was emancipated from slavery in Kentucky, quote, we took advantage of every opportunity to educate ourselves. The greater part of the plantation owners were very harsh if we were caught trying to learn or write. Our ignorance was the greatest hold the South had on us, end quote. By the outbreak of the Civil War, nearly every Southern state prohibited the education of enslaved people and barred them from possessing reading materials and writing instruments. Some of the laws authorized death as punishment. On 2 other occasions in 1854, white, quote, slave patrollers, end quote, in Mount Meigs, Alabama, burned alive enslaved black people suspected of possessing anti-slavery pamphlets. At the end of the Civil War, the ability to read and write became a symbol of freedom in the black community. Here's a picture of a black student said in class at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, 1902, from the Library of Congress. Schools for African Americans were places, quote, where the children of a once enslaved people may realize the blessing of liberty and education, end quote. Frederick Douglass stated in one of his final speeches, quote, education means emancipation. It means light and liberty. It means the uplifting of the soul of the man into the glorious light of the truth, the light only by which men can be free, end quote. Although black schools were illegal in most southern states, free African Americans had built, funded, and maintained small schools across the South for more than 3,000 black children by 1860. By 1863, 5% of enslaved people had secretly learned to read and write. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, newly emancipated African Americans established additional schools and churches in other gathering places. Quote, a black person riding on a loaded wagon or sitting on a hack waiting for a train or by the cabin doors, often seen, book in hand, delving in after the rudiments of knowledge. A group on the platform of a depot, after carefully conning an old spelling book, resolved itself into class, end quote. Freedmen's Bureau official. With the aid of the Freedmen's Bureau, philanthropy and from Northern aid societies, and funding from state Reconstruction government, black schools quickly opened across the South. Government agencies and charities provided most of the funding, but African Americans emerging from enslavement actively pursued educational opportunities for themselves and their children. Despite their minimal resources, black community purchased land, constructed buildings, and raised money to hire teachers. Rural black families moved nearer to towns and cities to give their children access to schools, and children in turn shared knowledge with older people who had to work rather than attend class, viewing the day's lessons with their parents and grandparents after school hours. And this is a picture of African American students on the lawn of Howard University, 1867. The first years after emancipation also witnessed the creation of the nation's first black colleges, including Howard University in Washington, D.C., and Fisk University in Tennessee. Black education was a target of violence as white communities clung to ideas of black inferiority and sought to trap black people in a, quote, freedom, unquote, limited to subservience. In fall 1870, white mobs burned nearly every colored church and schoolhouse in Tuskegee, Alabama. In Calhoun County, Alabama that year, a white mob outraged at the growth of a local black school lynched four black men named Tony Cliff, Barry Harris, Caesar Frederick, and William Hall, and also killed William Luke, a white man who had moved to Alabama from the north to teach freedmen. A Georgia newspaper reported merely that, quote, several Negroes and one white man have been buried to their long home through the false teachings of that white man, end quote. Emancipated black Americans sought education and worked to realize the promise of freedom, resisting economic exploitation. At the end of the Civil War, most black people lived in the South, where agriculture remained the dominant industry and land ownership had long been the clearest path to economic independence and self sufficiency. For the many black people thrust into freedom with years of experience working the land for white profit, scholar Edward Royce explains the prospect of finally holding their own land, quote, gave them the opportunity to reap the fruit of their own labor and to take care of themselves, end quote, and held the potential to, quote, make them truly free, end quote. Many formerly enslaved people dreamed that emancipation would bring that opportunity, but for most, it never materialized. News circulated after the war that the federal government was committed to land distribution. Whatever may have been planned, President Lincoln's April 1865 assassination by a Confederate sympathizer killed the prospect of meaningful black economic enhancement. Vice President and Tennessean Andrew Johnson rose to the presidency, initially promising to punish Southern traitors, quote unquote traitors, but by 1866 he had issued 7,000 pardons to successions. The slave expected to get 40 acres of land and a mule, but nobody got it as far as I know. We never got nothing, end quote. Ellis Kincannon, a black man enslaved in Tennessee as a youth. Johnson also rescinded orders granting black farmers tracts of land that the Union had seized from Southern white rebels during the war and instead returned the property to farmer Confederates. This left black people vulnerable to white Southerners who still held the vast majority of land and resources and remained determined to exploit black labor, quote, free, unquote, or not. Quote, there is really no difference, in my opinion, whether we hold them as absolute slaves or obtain their labor by some other method, end quote. A white Alabamian remarked in 1866. Another white Alabama resident similarly described the white South's idea of post-war restoration. There is a kind of innate feeling, a lingering hope among many in the South that slavery will be regalvanized in some shape or other. They tried by their laws to make a worse slavery than there was before. For the freedman has not now the protection which the master from interest gave him before. And this is a picture of two bales of cotton. A white manager weighs cotton picked by African American sharecroppers circa 1870. Left to navigate the quote free market, end quote, from a position of generations long disadvantage in a system dominated by white people determined to maintain racial inequality, black people found that freedom often meant poverty and desperation. Because most formerly enslaved people lacked the cash to buy land outright, and white landowners routinely refused to provide them credit. The government's refusal to provide targeted assistance meant that most freedmen could not build their own farms. Instead of facilitating black land ownership, President Johnson's policies ushered in sharecropping, a new practice that soon replaced slavery as a primary source of agricultural labor and black exploitation in the South. Under the sharecropping system, black laborers cleared, planted, and harvested land they did not own in exchange for a share of the crop, minus costs for food, supplies, and lodging, often in same quarters they had inhabited while enslaved, because the Johnson administration required landowners to pay off their debts to banks first. White people frequently shirked their duty to pay black sharecroppers who had no recourse. Even when they were paid, black sharecroppers were typically disadvantaged by the contracts that they signed under duress, and they were often told that their debt to the landowner was higher than their wages. This trapped many black families in a cycle of debt for generations, preventing them from accumulating capital to build wealth or buy their own property. Many black farmers had to take high interest loans as their only means of purchasing exorbitantly priced necessities, deepening the debt trap. When they tried to enforce contracts at the end of the season or negotiate better ones, they were met with violence from landowners or organized, quote, regulators, end quote, who used terror to force agreement. In freedom, black men, women, and children worked together to gain knowledge and share it with one another. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, some African Americans did manage to acquire land, build businesses, and achieve social mobility during Reconstruction. In a few cases, black people in the South obtained assistance from the Freedmen's Bureau and combined personal resources to buy shared farms or small plots of land. Shortly after the war's end, some black people, particularly those in the near larger cities, also began to open small businesses and establish themselves as blacksmiths, barbers, shoemakers, builders, and grocers. In Nashville, Tennessee, in 1871, a formerly enslaved black man named Henry Harding owned and managed one of the city's most popular hotels and built a net worth of $35,000. He later became one of the two largest black taxpayers in Davidson County. In Washington, D.C., the availability of some government jobs and establishment of Howard University created a magnet of black intellectuals and civic leaders. African Americans who moved to the nation's capital purchased property, built successful businesses, and pursued education for themselves and their children. In the years following the war, quote, the District of Columbia witnessed more than a doubling in the number of black people who owned business, 156 to approximately 318, and a significant increase in their average real and personal property holdings, end quote. More than 90% of black Americans resided in the South by 1870, and only 1%, 30,000 or more, live more than 3 million African Americans in the region own land. The convict leasing system worked to re enslave black people using the criminal justice system. Many black people became ensnared by a new form of slavery through the criminal law, convict leasing. As the Southern labor market faced a void left by emancipation, Southern legislators used a loophole in the 13th Amendment, which banned involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, to establish convict leasing. After creating discriminatory, quote, black codes, end quote, to criminalize newly freed black people as vagrants and loiterers, states passed laws authorizing public officials to lease prisoners to private industries. While states profited, prisoners earned no pay and faced inhumane, hazardous, and often deadly working conditions. Under these laws, thousands of black people were forced into a brutal system that historians have called, quote, worse than slavery, end quote. In Mississippi, convict leasing began in 1868. Colonel Edmund Richardson, a white man and antebellum millionaire who used convict labor to rebuild his fortune, signed a contract with the state allowing him to keep all profits from the labor of imprisoned men, nearly all of whom were black and formerly enslaved. According to an 1871 state report reviewing the leasing system, Richardson doled out labor assignments by race, sending only black convicts to clear and build levees on swampland he owned in the Delta. The few white prisoners and old and sick black prisoners remained at the state penitentiary in Jackson. Though largely uncritical, the report reviewing Richardson's operation between 1868 and 1871 documented dozens of prisoners killed by violence or disease. The widespread economic exploitation of black people continued for generations after slavery's end. Those who challenged the system of domination faced threats, violence, and even murder. Late in the summer of 1865, a white mob brutally killed 6 black men in Duplin County, North Carolina: Charles Winters, John Hurst, John Middleton, Thomas Bradley, and 2 men whose names were not recorded. According to testimony of a Union soldier, the 6 men had entered into a sharecropping agreement with their former slave owner and continued to work on a plantation where they had been enslaved. When the man later tried to evict the men without compensation for the work they had done, They insisted on their right to be paid. In response, the white man gathered his armed white neighbors, including law enforcement officers, and killed all 6 black men. While some newspapers attempt to justify the violence by reporting that one of the black men tried to, quote, to run away while his house was being searched for stolen property, end quote. Other reports made no attempt to conceal the white landowners, quote, intent, end quote, to terrify the Negroes into leaving without their share of the crop, end quote. This kind of violence was widespread. In a January 1866 letter to the Freedmen's Bureau, Brevet Major General Clinton B. Fisk, stationed in Centerville, Tennessee, reported that white residents were using rampant violence to maintain economic control over black people. Quote, since April 15, 1865, end quote, he wrote, referencing the date of President Lincoln's death. Quote, there have been numerous outrages committed against freedmen in this district, end quote. The violence committed was generally death. The rebels adopted this course to keep them in bondage up till June last, when a federal garrison was stationed at that place. During the rebellion, the freedmen was kept under control of their rebel masters by violence, for if any left their former master, they sent the young bands of bushwhackers after him, and when was found, he was deliberately shot down. This deterred many from leaving, and this today keeps them from getting remuneration for their work, which they perform under dread of maltreatment. I know of 5 or 6 having been killed in the manner of all for the above purpose.